Welcome to the Maritime Matters podcast. Did you know that 98% of Australia's trade passes through the maritime domain? 91% of its fuel is imported, and Australia's exclusive economic zone is larger than its mainland. It's easy to see that to Australia, maritime matters. Maritime Matters is the podcast where we break down what the week's events mean for Australia's maritime security and the wider Indo-Pacific. Hello, welcome to this episode of the Maritime Matters podcast. We're recording on Friday, the afternoon of Friday the 1st of November. So as always, when something dramatic happens over the next day or so before we manage to get this out, that's why it's not in blue. Hey Jen, how are things going? What have you been up to?
Hey Richard, happy November. Can't believe where the year's gone.
Don't say that.
Happy 19th episode of Maritime Matters, by the way. I know we should be celebrating 20, but I think we should celebrate number 19. So happy 19th episode. What have I been up to? Not a lot. Speaking about the Indian Ocean and how important the Indian Ocean is to Australia's security, specifically Australia's maritime security. So that was good fun at NSC. I don't think it's recorded online, but I am going to post something later with kind of a summary of my talking points if anyone is interested in the Indian Ocean. And I have a piece coming out in Aspie's The Strategist maybe today, but if not, early next week, talking more broadly about ADF careers and ADF recruitment and the old adage of, is it better to advertise joining a service or is it better to advertise joining the ADF? And I talk about the Canadian Armed Forces example. I'm going to get the years wrong, but let's say between 1968 and 2011, they actually merged their three services to become one, not only in their legislation, but also in practice. So in terms of uniform and ranks, etc. And it talks about some of the lessons learned and the importance of service identity to morale and a sense of purpose. And on that has inspired the Did You Know for today, where I'm going to talk about Arthur Tang. And thank you very much. Just a shout out to Charlotte Hagen at ADFA, who highlighted that we have been skipping our Did You Know segments. So we've been a bit lazy and we've been caught out, Richard.
Oh, no, we've been remiss. This is, as you say, we've been caught out. That's no good at all.
What have you been up to?
Me, I've nothing as exciting as you've been. I have not managed to be getting my fingers to the keyboard as much as I would like in the lead up to all of our exams and things like this here. So that's been taking up most of my time. So I'm hopefully going to manage to get back to writing something relatively soon. So we're going to dive straight in and talk about what has been happening in the region. And do you want to kick us off talking about some PLAN developments?
Yeah, look, thanks so much, Richard. So on social media in the last couple of days, we've seen some pretty impressive imagery that's been socialized, originating from the People's Liberation Army Navy, of the first time that we have seen two Chinese Navy aircraft carriers operating together. And certainly that's been doused as quite significant in terms of the evolution of their operational capability. And you've got to remember that China first commissioned their first aircraft carrier only 12 years ago. So they have come a long way in terms of now having three at sea, two in commission, the third one expected to be commissioned in 2025. So this photo itself, it included the Liaoning CV-16 and the Shandong CV-17 sailing together in close formation in the South China Sea, which I suspect was also part of the messaging, with about 12 J-15 fighter aircraft flying over the top. And it was supported by some Type 55 DDGs and some other escorts like Type 52 Deltas and 54 Alpha FFGs. So it was a pretty impressive photo, and if you haven't seen it, I recommend you check it out. But really, it kind of is an image that demonstrates how far China has come. So the Liaoning that was in the photo was commissioned in 2012. Now, that's a really old aircraft carrier. It certainly doesn't compare to, some of the US or the UK aircraft carriers in operation in terms of capability, but it has been used largely as a training aircraft carrier, and it has been the key element that's allowed the Chinese Navy to develop aircraft carrier capability. They got it for a steal from Ukraine in 1998. and then modernized it and put it to sea. It also had the Shandong. Now, the Shandong was only commissioned in December 2019. Again, it's a fairly small aircraft carrier, not particularly capable, but significantly is the first aircraft carrier that China had built in China, as opposed to the Liaoning, which was purchased, as I mentioned before. So look, I think it's a pretty impressive photo. It is a symbol of China's growing capability. Certainly, their aircraft carriers, including the new one, the Fujian, which will be quite different because it will have catapults, so much more capable, be able to get much more aircraft in the air at a quicker rate. They're certainly still not comparable, I would say, to the US aircraft carrier fleet, but it does show the improvement. What's your take on the photo exercise, or the two aircraft carriers operating together?
So I think the photex, well, it's always so difficult to know, well, what's it about, who's it for. I think one of the things that we kind of often forget about the development of the Chinese Navy, and I think the carrier is probably the most extreme example of this, is that there's a huge prestige element to this that speaks to a domestic audience. States build navies, at least in part, because that's what they think big states should do. And building a navy fit for a great power is something that is sort of a driver behind the wider expansion of the PLAN. That's perhaps slightly separate from the kind of the strategic role. Obviously, those two things overlap. But there is a part of this is about China demonstrating that it is a great power. And carriers are the ultimate status symbol in terms of naval kit these days. And so this is about saying, look, we are here. There is only one other nation in the world, realistically, that can operate two carriers together, and that's the US. I mean, I don't think we've ever seen the UK actually operating both of their carriers together.
We actually have. There is actually a photo. I don't know if you can classify it as operating, but there is a photo of them two together with aircraft in the air. They did it as soon as they commissioned the second one.
Okay, I stand corrected.
Right.
But it is certainly not something that you see very often outside of the US. So it's a symbol. It's a status symbol. Now, it also presumably is helping them work out how to actually operate these things. One of the things that comes through quite clearly when you listen to American sort of commentators, particularly senior naval officers, is that this is hard. It takes a long time to learn how to do carrier operations, and the Chinese are learning, and they learn by doing. They can't leverage off the experience of someone like the United States in a way that others can do. So I think it's interesting. It's an important development. Probably not worth reading too much into in terms of what's actually happening, given that they've chosen to publish these photographs, everything else. But it speaks to the wider piece.
It certainly does. And speaking of exercises that speak to a wider conversation, there's been another exercise that's been happening. What's that?
So this is Exercise Autonomous Warrior. Exercise Autonomous Warrior is something that's been going around for a little while. I think it dates back to 2018. It's a primarily Australian-based exercise, sort of looking at autonomous kit, a range of autonomous kit in the maritime domain. And there have been a number of ones. One a couple of years ago, I think maybe 2022, focused on HADR. And so there's been this sort of exercise been going for a while, but it has been supercharged by its connection, certainly this year, with Orcus Pillar 2, and what is wonderfully referred to as Maritime Big Play, which I think we've mentioned before. I'm going to struggle to get through this without laughing at the names and the acronyms. I cannot tell if somebody is having a joke here. But yeah. Anyway, let's get the detail out first, and we can have a laugh later. So, Autonomous Warrior 2024, really big exercise, including a lot of kind of big uncrewed systems that we've been talking about. So we saw Ghost Shark. We saw some of the Remus UUVs were there. Speartooth was there. The Oceus Bluebottle, which has been kind of one of the premier Australian USV platforms that's in operation. And so quite a lot of these sorts of things were being sort of operating. What I think is actually in some ways the slightly more interesting element of this, certainly from my perspective, is around not merely the systems, but also the real focus on kind of shared communications and command and control systems. Now, again, reading the different sort of press releases from the Brits, the Australians, and the Americans, you get slightly different perspectives, and all of these systems seem to then have different acronyms and things. So the Americans talk about the Multi-Domain Uncrewed Secure Integrated Communications System, MUSIC, whilst the Royal Navy had a different system, not sure if it's connected, called StrikeNet, which allowed them to remotely pilot kit owned by both the US and Australia, as well as UK systems. So this clearly fits into the Orcus Pillar 2 space. There was also mention of something called Sonics, which is around information sharing for sonar buoys and kind of collation of this data. Whether or not this is the same stuff that we heard about in relation to Pillar 2 with the P8 sonar buoy stuff, I'm not sure. I haven't seen confirmation either way. But clearly there's a lot of work on the kind of the integration, background and backroom integration of these kind of platforms and systems. And then just to add fun to it all, the Americans were talking about technology readiness experimentation, which has the wonderful acronym of TREX, to throw into the joyous melange of acronyms. I guess the final thing I'll flag on this before we have a chat is that there was Japanese JMSDF and other Japanese officers there as observers. So this very clearly kind of points to the suggestions and the statements that came out about a month or so ago about the idea of Japan being considered as a potential partner within Orcus Pillar 2 in this, or collaborator, I think, rather than partner of Orcus Pillar 2 in this kind of space. So I think you're seeing sort of movement in that direction. What were your thoughts on the variety of different press releases and everything else that we suddenly got about Autonomous Warrior?
Well, I guess the good thing I want to start with is it was great to see how much press seemed to be engaged in Autonomous Warrior. So I saw it reported in major newspapers. Obviously, we saw the press releases. I think that a lot of people were invited down to observe it. So I think that's really good. We did sing Pitch Black's praises for doing the same thing during Exercise Pitch Black, and kind of condemn Exercise Kakadu for not really having that kind of engagement, nobody really knowing what happened or what went on there. So I think that's really good. Look, in terms of how significant this is, look, it's hard to say. I haven't really compared it to previous Autonomous Warriors. It certainly seems bigger, and it certainly seems longer. How well all these systems work together, what they achieved, all these acronyms, look, that's honestly hard to assess. And certainly when you read it, it's impressive. So I'm impressed. But I've also seen plenty of press releases full of acronyms that tend to mean not a lot. So look, I think it's great we're working on this stuff. It's great to see Autonomous Warrior beefed up. It's clearly got a re-energization under Orcus Pillar 2. As I think I said on the ABC Live the other day, I think Maritime Big Play is the worst exercise name I have ever had. And I think Greg Jennett was trying to hold himself from not laughing as I was saying that, because he's the consummate professional. But look, I think it's good. I think it's a good direction to go in. Absolutely. And great to see some Australian-made capabilities.
Yeah, and I think that it's also really good to see some sort of traction with Orcus Pillar 2 stuff. For a long time, there's been this sort of black box that was Orcus Pillar 2, and we are beginning to see that unpicked in a number of different ways. So seeing something happening and kind of meat on the bones. Now, as you say, how effective how good the music actually is, or whether or not the T-Rex worked, is a kind of a moot point at this stage. But there is something there, and in the wider Orcus piece, I think that's also important.
So I agree, but I just add one slight replicharge, which is a lot of this is rebadged effort that was already in progress before Orcus was announced. So I think that yes, absolutely, but I think we need to be careful. I think that there's been a theme this year of a lot of announcements that are rebadged efforts, including the recent Guio announcements. Sorry, Guio, by the way, I did get pulled up by one of our commentators on YouTube. Guided weapons and explosive ordnance. No more acronyms. Yeah.
Oh, okay, excellent.
Yeah.
Okay.
We've been called out for using too many acronyms and not making a lot of sense.
I mean, as somebody who constantly complains about defence using too many acronyms and using words that don't mean anything, I feel I should sort of go and hide under a stone at this point. But we'll try and use plain English as much as possible.
Yeah.
And talking of plain language, or not so plain language, Chinese Coastguard operations moving beyond the usual discussions of focusing on the Philippines. What's been happening?
Yeah, I mean, it's not really new. So certainly we've had Chinese Coast Guard ships operating in the North Natuna Sea in the last week. Now, of course, under international maritime law and the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, the Chinese Coast Guard ships can operate wherever they wish to do so, so long as they comply with certain passive regimes. The issue here is that Indonesia had commissioned some surveying the North Natuna Sea, which is predominantly part of Indonesia's exclusive economic zone, kind of at the southern point of the South China Sea, just inside China's 9-line claim, is thought to be very, very resource rich. And so Indonesia had commissioned a vessel to do some surveying, and this Coast Guard vessel from China 3 times interfered with surveying operations, which is something that you are not meant to do under international law. Collision regulations are very clear about manoeuvring in the vicinity of a surveying vessel. I think the timing is probably the most interesting part of this activity. So it comes just after the new president of Indonesia, Prabowo, was inaugurated on the 20th of October. And so I do think there is something in it in terms of the timing and potentially testing how he might respond to these things. Now, of course, Prabowo has shown that he does have a good relationship with China. When he was first elected before inauguration, he visited China first out of any other country, right? And he spoke about the importance of China for Indonesia's development. But certainly we have seen that, as much as kind of the movements of Coast Guard ships might seem pretty obviously tactical, we certainly have seen this prodding and poking around different areas of the South China Sea being used to send a strategic message. So I think that it's not implausible that the timing of this was significant to see how Prabowo would respond. What's interesting in the response, I think, is how much Indonesia publicised these incidents and taking a leaf out of the Philippines playbook. And this is something that Indonesia hasn't actually really done before, and putting out photos of these incidents, telling the media about these incidents. Clearly, there's that element of that assertive transparency campaign that the Philippines have been doing that Indonesia has played here. And that's different. And that's clearly, I think, come out as a consequence of the change of the president. So I wonder if this shows a new forceful approach from Indonesia. We'll have to wait and see. What's your take on it?
Well, I find this a really interesting one, because the Indonesians continue to insist that there is no dispute, which, again, even the fact that this incident arose, and the Indonesians released a video showing the back and forth between the two vessels, so the Indonesian vessel and the Chinese Coast Guard vessel, in which the Chinese say that they are in waters under Chinese jurisdiction, and the Indonesians say, no, you're in the Indonesian EEZ, which kind of rather puts pours water on the idea of there not being a dispute. So I think that's interesting that they're kind of willing to, as you say, put this out there. Does it speak to a slightly different approach? I think that is it's going to be interesting to see how that does play out. Prabowo, whilst he has unquestionably sort of made a play or indicated sort of continuing support for China, or sort of engagement with China through his activities immediately after the election, he also has a reputation for being slightly more sort of not belligerent's not quite the right word, but willing to push and be slightly more assertive in particularly in foreign policy areas, and very much kind of the Indonesian nationalist type line. So how that relationship plays out, I think, will be definitely worth keeping an eye on, and whether or not we see a different approach more broadly from Indonesia. So yeah, definitely one to keep a bit of an eye on. What else has been going on in the South China Sea?
Yeah, look, so there's been some media releases around the Philippines and what they're calling their Comprehensive Archipelagic Defense Concept, CADC. Now, that's not new. We have heard about that before. And it's really about thinking of themselves as an archipelago. So this concept relies on bolstering some of their islands and thinking about that kind of idea of defense in depth for the archipelago. In some ways, kind of taking a leaf out of China's book in a way. So out of the Spratly Islands, there is an island called Thitu Island, which is claimed by a number of countries, but is currently under the Philippines' control. The Philippines call it Pag-asa. It's about 473 kilometers from Palawan. China also claims it, but it is a very, very long way from China, as the Spratly Islands broadly are. So what they're talking about doing is they're going to be extending the airstrip on Thitu Island to be about 1.5 kilometers, which allows much more significant aircraft. So things like C-130 cargo planes to land. It means that basically you could bolster it with troops, radars, equipment, etc., if you chose to do so. There's a few more things in terms of the upgrade of that island, but I think the significant thing is we are seeing the Philippines move on this new strategy, which is looking outwards. For a long time, the defense strategy within the Philippines was very much a territorial strategy, looking inwards because of the threat of terrorism within the Philippines. And we saw that manifest in a number of ways. So this is a shift in their strategy, and this is kind of investment to start bolstering that strategy of comprehensive archipelagic defense. So I think that's interesting. I'm lucky enough to be heading to the Philippines this week, actually, to speak at the Manila Dialogue. So hopefully when I come back, I'll have a little bit more about what the Philippines are doing to bolster their military capability. Certainly they've announced a number of elements of modernization and enhancement, but we know there are some financial challenges with that. Any comments on the new developments from the Philippines or their strategy more broadly?
No, I think it's interesting to see. It'll be the main thing is less about the strategy itself, as you sort of hinted at. It's about whether or not they've got the capacity to actually make it happen. And I guess to a degree, that's why we're seeing so much closer kind of engagement with partners as well, and how that fits into that sort of strategic approach. So yeah, again, interesting to see, and it'll be really interesting to hear your take from time in Manila. Moving on, because we've got to talk about capability, and we're as ever against the clock.
We always are against the clock.
Always. Big story that we still know very little about is the report yesterday of a significant fire at the BAE Systems shipyard in Barrow-on-Furness in the north of England. This is the very significant facility that builds and maintains Britain's nuclear submarine fleet. The current primary work is on the last two Astute-class submarines, but there's also significant work going on the first, well, I think on all, maybe three, maybe all four of the replacement SSBNs, the Dreadnought class. So this is a big facility. Obviously, it's also crucial in wider Orcus Pillar 1 elements. The first of the new SSN Orcus will be built at this shipyard in Barrow-on-Furness. We really don't know very much about what's actually happened. There's a few bits and pieces came out largely from the police and others kind of reassuring people that there's no nuclear risk. Unsurprisingly, that was something of a concern for people living around there for a while. Also some indications of the fact that a few people were injured, primarily smoke inhalation and the like. But in terms of actual impact on capability and the sort of capacity of the shipyard to do what it's there to do, we don't really know.
No.
But it's could be a significant bad news issue. The other thing which flagged very quickly, and again we just don't know, is around causes. Now, it is not at all unusual for there to be fires in shipyards and fires in ships undergoing maintenance work, etc. You've only got to look at things like the Bonhomme Richards. The Russians have had similar issues. This is not uncommon at all, but there have also been a spate of fires and other events at very sort of key strategic defence facilities in Europe, particularly kind of manufacturing facilities, which have been linked sort of both publicly and off the record to Russian sabotage. Now, I think it is far too early to reach that conclusion, but it is also too early to rule that out. So that could be an even bigger story.
It could be. And look, I think this is one, is incredibly interesting. I think that there's been a lot of conclusions drawn already. I saw some news articles saying Orcus has been scuppered, etc., etc. I'm paraphrasing. But look, I think this is a wait and see, and potentially there won't actually be any more information around it apart from this. I think in terms of the comments that Orcus has been scuppered, I think it's a bit early to make that comment, especially the Australian kind of Orcus SSN element, because of course Phase 1 and Phase 2 of the Optimal Submarine Pathway Plan don't rely on that shipyard whatsoever. But I think there is a kind of a broader point here about how paper thin some of the industrial capacity is of the UK, the US, Australia. When you have, and I make this point kind of about the sinking of the Matawanui for New Zealand, when you have one of a capability, and this comment is scalable to kind of your industrial capability, then you are very, very vulnerable, right? And, in Australia, we could make that example about our dry dock, Captain Cook Dry Dock in Sydney, very, very important for maintenance of ships. We have one dry dock. So I think that there's just a kind of a reinforcement of the need to really have redundancy and resilience in key industrial capability that supports maritime capability. Now, that's not easy to do when you're talking about nuclear submarine shipyards, and sometimes in terms of the cost, it's simply implausible, but it is a key vulnerability.
And that speaks to one of the aims of AUKUS, right, is that it will mean that there will be an additional nuclear submarine construction facility amongst the AUKUS countries. At the moment there are 3, and that will in time rise to 4. And that is seen as important for a host of reasons, so not least this one. So that in some ways, whilst yes, that this could be posing challenges to AUKUS in one light, it also in fact kind of reinforces the value proposition in another way. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, we haven't touched on it, we won't touch on it much here, but the Guided Weapons Explosive Ordnance Plan that was released by the Australian government this week, that kind of gets after that as well in terms of creating redundancy. And that's one of the reasons that Australia needs to have its own, or its ability to build GWEO itself. There are obviously questions about the GWEO we're building and the timeframes, that we won't get into that on Maritime Matters.
Briefly touching on a couple of other capability stories. So we mentioned Ghost Shark, which was taking part in exercise Autonomous Warrior in Jarvis Bay and its surrounds over the past month or so. Elsewhere in the Indo-Pacific, I think, we saw the American XLUV, so their very large UUV, which is being built by Boeing, the Orca. Now, this has had, I say checkered history, it hasn't had a checkered history, but it has suffered from some significant delays and issues. But it underwent one of its significant trials over the past week, a 48-hour endurance trial running autonomously, including surfacing and snorting to recharge its battery. We know that this operates on a kind of a diesel-electric conventional submarine basis. We still don't, as far as I'm aware, know the propulsion system for Ghost Shark, but the assumption is it must be something broadly similar. So interesting to see further development in the XL UUV space, but I think we're still a little way away from these being really operational. The other one, which I'll touch on briefly, is announced just earlier today, which is that Austal have delivered the 8th evolved Cape class patrol boat to the Royal Australian Navy. And I'm going to butcher the name again, but I believe it is the Cape Shanak. But I'm sure somebody can come and somebody from Victoria can come and tell me how I've definitely got that wrong. But this, I think, broadly speaking, and I know there have been certain questions, but broadly speaking, I think the Evolved Cape class is a clear kind of good news story, or at least broad good news story for Australian shipbuilding. So this is the 8th hull. It was originally a 6-hull program. It's now extended to 10, and they're being delivered broadly kind of on time and on budget. And it's key part of kind of what's happening out at Henderson at the moment. So I would suggest a pretty positive story, all in all.
I think so, and I think it just goes. I have a lot of faith in Australian shipbuilding now. People might be watching this, splurting their coffee across the screen as I make that comment. I'm a glass half full kind of person generally, but I do, and I think there's a lot of good success stories in our history. Although interestingly, and we're not going to touch on it here, there was a piece in the Australian this week where somebody, I can't remember who wrote it, was jumping up in arms that we were going to buy the first 3 frigates of C3000 that must be getting released soon in terms of the down select. Like it's got to be getting announced. I mean, it's got to be, right? It's either November or it's not announced until kind of February next year.
Are you suggesting that nothing happens in Canberra in December and January? God forbid! How dare you?
I mean, I live in Canberra, but I'm suggesting nothing happens in Canberra. But no, that's not true. Everybody should move to Canberra. It's great. And if you're in the military, you should want to post to Canberra. It's fantastic. You learn about how the world works. But anyway, my point, I had a point, was that they're criticising that the first 3 were going to be built overseas, and we should be able to build them all here. And yes, we should, but everything is about opportunity cost, and there is time versus having the ideal solution. And time is not on our side, as we have discussed a number of times. The RAN currently operates 10 surface combatants, which will reduce to 9, or is expected to reduce to 9 in 2026. But anyway, look, I think we have a good shipbuilding future ahead of us. I was lucky enough to interview the Chief of Army this week for a Saltwater Strategist podcast. So there's a double plug that will come out this weekend, talking about Army's greater foray into littoral manoeuvre and their craft, and certainly the building of the Army littoral manoeuvre craft, whether it be the landing craft medium or the landing craft heavy that were accelerated by the government this year, is going to be another key step up in that shipbuilding to getting Henderson to the point of building the general purpose frigates. Of course, we won't touch on the Hunter class in South Australia because we don't have all day to talk about that. Anything else on capability before we bring back Did You Know?
No, I would just add to your discussion of C3000 about the fact that precisely that. The idea is we're going to start having landing craft medium by 2026 and landing craft heavy by 2028. as was flagged, I think, again by Pat Conroy in his speech on whenever it was Tuesday.
Wednesday.
So that's going to have to start happening very fast to meet those kind of deadlines. So the idea of trying to do that and everything else, or do C3000 on top of that, it's going to be a challenge as it is. So let alone trying to shoehorn anything more into that. But anyway, we're running out of time, so I'll stop rabbiting, and you can take the Did You Know?
Right. So I think this is an interesting Did You Know? And as I said at the start of this episode, thank you very much again to Charlotte Hagen for calling us out for skipping the Did You Know, which is just out of pure laziness because often we don't know. But today I'm going to talk
Don't
about.
Tell them that.
I'm too honest. It's my fault. I'm going to talk about the Tange Reforms, which is something that I've only had to kind of really look into recently. And so effectively, the Tange Reforms, named after Sir Arthur Tange, they occurred in the early 1970s. And effectively, they completely reshaped how we think about Australian defence, certainly the bureaucratic elements of Australian defence. And what it did was it consolidated the previous separate departments of the Navy, the Army, and the Air Force into the Department of Defence as we know it today. They were pretty important reforms at the time, and certainly in many ways have been proven to be positive reforms. But there are some challenges with them. So the reforms were the work, as I mentioned, of Sir Arthur Tange, who was a senior Australian public servant. He served as the Secretary of the Department of Defence, was also known for other key roles, Secretary of the Department of External Affairs, a pretty well-known kind of Mandarin in Australian history, one of the more significant. So under the Tange Reforms, the biggest thing was the dissolution of the individual ministers for each branch of the armed forces. So until the Tange Reforms in the 70s, I mean, this has chopped and changed a bit in Australia's history, but we had a minister for the Navy, the Army, and the Air Force. And so that was kind of eradicated in the aim of streamlining command, eliminating service silos, and centralising the command and control. And this is well before the kind of joint headquarters era that developed in, somebody's going to call me out, I'm going to say the early 90s, early 2000s. Not joint headquarters Bungadore, that came much later, but the whole joint headquarters era used to be near Fleet Base East, is what I hear. Anyway, so this kind of centralised it under one defence. It was intended to enhance efficiency and foster greater cooperation between the services, which there are a lot of historical examples of why that was required, let alone the loss of the Navy's aircraft carrier. But we won't get into that here. Still blame the Army. But it meant that each of the branches lost their direct advocate in the cabinet. It also meant that the understanding of the minister in terms of the intricacies of that service was a lot less. So previously the Minister for the Navy knew a lot more, for example, about how a Navy functioned. A lot of people have said that it was really fundamental to where we are now and a really positive change, and most people kind of support that. But one of the criticisms has been the idea of the loss of service identity and how that has been balanced against the joint. And I think this is a really important conversation right now when we see themes like the integrated force, which is incredibly important, but what does that mean for service identity? Is service identity important? It also is a question about how much, we talk about capability delays, how much the current Minister for Defence, of course we have the Minister for Defence Industry and Minister for Veterans Affairs, but broadly comes under the Minister of Defence, how much goes over their desk because it is effectively one minister. And is there a capacity issue there? And that's not about any specific minister, it's just about when you push everything through one point. So I think it's an open conversation about whether this is the right structure moving forward. I'm not suggesting changing the Department of Defence, but is there the adequate ministerial representation? And so I thought it was important to talk about the Tange Reforms of the 1970s, and how we got where we are. Any comments on that, Richard?
I love this kind of stuff, right? This is absolutely my bag, but I think there's so much here you can unpack, and about whether the kind of the shift purple that fits as part of the kind of the wider shift with the Tange Reform is the Tange Reforms is a positive step. Obviously, this creates the so-called diarchy with the Secretary of Defence and the CDF, who then report up to the Minister, which again actually reduces the influence not only in terms of the politics but also the service chiefs. So actually it begins to change some of those dynamics as well. So really interesting part of Australia's defence history, and how we end up where we are, and how it is that the Department of Defence works or doesn't work. I would kind of flag also that I don't think there's always a right way, right? And that's the other thing, is that we can say, oh, well, you can do things differently, but every way has its strengths and its weaknesses. So I think you'll always see people who object and say that this was a dreadful step and should be unpacked, but then they don't necessarily acknowledge the issues that existed beforehand that drove the reforms in the first place. So always a fun conversation.
And I think it's worth acknowledging that the Australia was ahead of the game in terms of the trend towards jointness. And I think it's been very important. And actually, we've seen, countries such as, China kind of went through this journey in 2015. It's been quite effective for them. Indonesia is now trying to go through this journey. It is kind of one of the measures of a modern defence force, whether they have the jointness and the ability. But I think there is a question there about moving forward into the strategic circumstances that we discuss almost daily. Not a question around the jointness, that's incredibly important, but a question around, does the ministerial structure support the decision-making that we're going to need to do in the event of a crisis or conflict? And is the reduction of the influence of the service chiefs the right direction? And I think there's lots of interesting things to write about on that. So if you're interested in finding an idea for an op-ed or a piece, I would say explore this one. Look forward to reading it.
Absolutely. And on that note, I think we're going to have to wrap up, because as ever, we're out of time. So much to talk about. Lots of things.
I do wonder if anyone ever listens this far.
Nah, absolutely not. This is just us ranting, right? Anyway, on that note, I'll say thanks a lot, Jen. Good to chat, and we'll be back again soon.
Thanks, Richard.